going to go ahead and get started. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here today. My name is Gerald Padilla, and today I would like to present to you a wonderful organization and a group of extraordinary group of people that I want to introduce today. Today we have the Coalition of New Chicano and Chicana Artists, C.O.N.C.A. C.O.N.C.A is a nonprofit organization exclusively dedicated to the promotion, advancement, development, and cultivation of the Chicano and Chicana arts, as well as cultural and political awareness. In this capacity, C.O.N.C.A stimulates and facilitates dialogues among disciplines, languages, and traditional and contemporary expressions. Currently, the group has been responsible in hosting poetry readings, including the Fists in the Air celebration of women and activists as activists and artists, facilitating a poetry boxing match, and holding creative writing workshops in high schools which discuss identity. Currently, C.O.N.C.A is working on a book entitled Nuevas, Voces, Poeticas, a dialogue about the new Chicano and Chicana poetics to be published in 2014, discussing the state of the Chicano and Chicana movement since 9/11. First, we will have Christopher Carmona. He is a Chicano beat poet. He was a nominee for the Alfredo Cisneros de Miral Foundation Award for writers in 2011 and a Pushcart Prize nominee in 2013. He has been published in numerous journals and magazines. His first collection of poetry, called Beat, was published by Salute Press, and his second book, I Have Always Been Here, is published by Voces Press. Currently, he is the organizer of the annual Beat Poetry and Arts Festival and the artistic director of the Coalition of New Chicano and Chicana Artists. We will also have Rossy Evelin Lima, creative writer and linguist. She has been published in several journals in the USA, Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, Canada, and Spain. She received the Gabriel Mistral Award by the National Hispanic Honor Society in 2009 and has received several awards for poetry. Her poetry book, Ecos de Barro, was published by Otras Voces this year, and she is the Chief Operations Officer of the Coalition of New Chicano and Chicana Artists. Today we will also have Gabriel Sanchez, who is a writer and poet from the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. He is a graduate of the University of Texas Pan American and also a publisher under the name The Raving Press. His poetry is at times historical, political, and edgy, and is featured in spoken word events and online. He is the Director of Public Relations for the Coalition of New Chicano and Chicana Artists. And last but not least, we will also have Isaac Chavarria, who considers himself a poch. Isaac has an MFA in creative writing from the University of Texas Pan American. He assists nonprofit organizations in producing chapbooks for workshop participants. His poems are in the Acentos Review and Rio Grande Review online. His first book of poetry, called Poch, was published by Salute Press in 2013. Ultimately, he hopes the term poch will represent a positive identity rather than a pejorative. He is the Executive Director of the Coalition of New Chicano and Chicana Artists. And now, without further ado, we will begin this presentation with Christopher Carmona.
Okay, well, thank you guys for coming out. The way we're going to do this presentation is really going to be, we're going to present for about 10 minutes. Each of us are going to present different identities. And then after that, we're going to have a Q&A session. We usually have done this in the past as a round table, where we just ask a lot of questions. But we found as we've been doing these different presentations that it's better if we establish what we're talking about first. And so we're going to give us short presentations before we open up to actual discussion here. So that's basically how it's going to go. Well, each of us is going to represent, talk about a different aspect of what's been going on. Our book, which is going to be put out in 2014. One thing we started doing this is because there really hasn't been a chronicle of Chicano and Chicano poetry in the past since 2001, which is a really important year for Chicano movement. Another important year is 2008 with the election of Obama and the rise of the Tea Party and Arizona. So there's a lot of things that have happened in the past 12 years that hasn't really been written about. So a lot of that is what we've been looking at and researching. And also we've been seeing how the poets have really come together in the past 12 years in different ways. And overall, that's what we've been doing for about a year now. And we'd like to thank the Chicano Research Center for having us out here. It's our first time connecting with the California contingent of the Chicano movement. We've been in Texas mostly, and we're going to be jumping up to New York City in May. So this is kind of the first real connection we made here. So we're going to talk about the different identities here. The one I'm discussing is called Xicanindio. Xicanindio is a term that I learned from a poet named Raul Salinas. If you're not familiar with Raul Salinas, Raul's, he ran a bookstore in Austin, Texas called Resistencia, which is a staple for Chicano native and queer rights in Austin. It's been around for 30 plus years. And Raul really he's the one that introduced me to this term and what it actually means. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. Xicanindio. Xicanindio is not so much an identity, it's a bridge between identities. Between Mexican heritage, my American imprint, and my Indian, lost but not forgotten. As a Chicano, I know that my stories include an indigenous root, but that connection has been buried in European and American traditions and stories. Even though I have a mixture of Mexican and American, which makes a unique border culture, I feel at a loss because I do not have that piece of myself. When I was 10 years old, a traveling salesman came to my grandparents' house and he sold my grandfather a Carmona genealogy plaque with a family crest. And that genealogy traced the ancestry back to Spain and Portugal. But it made no mention of our native roots, where we come from in here in the Mestizaje. It's this lost connection to indigeneity that is at the core of Xicanindio. To be honest, I did not have much need for this for a long time, and I did not really try to find my connection to my Indio story until really about a few years ago. Much of the time I was trying to balance Mexican-American identities and losing myself in the struggle. The Pocho in me wanted to be wanted only the American sensibilities. The Chicano in me wanted to resist and embrace the border identity of Mexican-American. But there was still a question of the Indio roots. It wasn't until I was 32 and I was speaking with my father that, that I found out about my indigenous roots. It was interesting because my father was doing research on our family, and where we're from, which is the deep South Texas, which is right on the Mexico-U.S. border, literally about 6 miles from the river. I teach at the University of Texas Brownsville, which is actually on the river, and on the bridge. There's a parking lot, there's the bridge, where you can basically walk across. Brownsville and Matamoros. You want to be familiar with Matamoros because it's been in the news a lot lately because of the Mexican drug wars, like Juarez and El Paso. Well, Matamoros is the East Coast version of that. So this whole area here is where my father was researching. He was researching where my family came from, mostly his grandmother, my great-grandmother. And when he told me, it was that she came from Yaqui country, basically Yaqui country. She was a Yaqui Indian. I never knew this. 30 years of my life, and I never knew we were Yaqui. We had Yaqui blood in us. And a lot of this comes from the fact that in Mexican culture, there is a huge shame in recognizing your indigenous roots. And so that's really where my journey started. He had tracked it down to the village, and Ron found out that our family had really been in that area, South Texas, for a long, long time, 500 plus years. So where Chicano usually refers to an Aztlan connection between the Aztecs and the Mayans, Xicanindio really looks at the connection, which is the actual native tribes and the native peoples that we come from, actually tracking that down. And for a long time it was thought that we couldn't track it, that history is lost. And so we ended up creating the Satslan, which is a necessary thing to reconnect with our past, as what the 60s did. I'm not saying it isn't. But what Xicanindio did, which Raul Salinas taught me, is that we're actually very close to knowing our native history. We just never asked the right questions. Because our families, our Mexican families, have done a lot of work to erase that part of who we are. And so when we start to do the research, you start to realize that you're very close to these, not just in basically through DNA or genetics, but through customs and practices. Raul always told me that it's always through practice that culture is transmitted. And that is really where we have to get back to. When I was a graduate student at Texas A&M, I met a friend of mine who, at the time, he taught me Cherokee for a year. And it was an informal group. There was only about 5 or 6 of us. And because he was Cherokee Indian, he was Two-Spirit. And if y'all know what Two-Spirit is, you ever heard of Two-Heart? And it's basically I guess you would call it the LGBT version of Native identity. And so we spent about a year learning Cherokee, the Cherokee language. So I can speak like a 2-year-old basically right now. I mean, it's not that the fact that you kind of fall out of practice when you're not around that kind of environment. And so, I also found out that, my nephews, because my sister-in-law's grandmother is Apache, so my nephews are Apache as well. And so there's a lot of Indian blood that we just don't recognize, and this is kind of bringing it back here. And when I was speaking with Joy Harjo, if you're all familiar with Joy Harjo, the Native American poet in Muskogee, we brought her down to read at Texas A&M, and I was driving her around. And it's really when she told me the one line that kind of stuck with me from that. She said that, Mexicans and Mexican Americans or Chicanos and Native peoples are cousins. We're all from the same family. And so this is where our bridges should really start to build. So this is what really started me on this search in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of things going into this, but one of them is really recovering language as practice. All right. Language is an important thing. Language is a living thing. It's one of the best transmitters of culture. And once we start recovering these languages, once you start to actually speak a different language, a language that's indigenous to this area, any language really, Spanish works as well. Once you start to speak it, it has culture embedded in it, and the way that the thought is processed in the language changes the way you see the world. It always does. So when you connect with these languages that are thought to be long gone, even though there's over 2 million Cherokee people, it does something. It changes the way you look at things in the world. And so recovering language is what I've been doing. And with Rossy, who will talk about her experience, also reconnecting with the Nahuatl. And that language has also helped to really start to think about the world differently. And a lot of the things that we think are lost are embedded in these things. So this is really one of the things that I was going to talk about. So a lot of my poetry recently has really been about connecting Chicano, or what we call Latino, Mexican American, and native ideas in poetry. So I'm going to read you 2 different poems, but the first one is actually a poem in epigraphs, and it's basically put together. None of these are my words. There's 2 lines in here that repeat a lot, and they're very harmful to the native community. The first one, as long as the grass grows and the water runs. The ending of that statement is that the white man will always own this land, and this was used against the native peoples for about 100 years. So it's and the other one is, get thee a little further, you are too near me. That is what Andrew Jackson told the native peoples as he was pushing them, and he kept on saying it, get a little further, you are too near me. So they kept on being pushed further and further west. So those 2 lines are kind of what this whole poem is framed around. So this poem is called Language is Never Neutral. As long as the grass grows and the water runs, most people would rather die than think. Many do. I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. Get a little further, you are too near me. A people's dream died there, it was a beautiful dream. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. As long as the grass grows and the water runs, silence is argument carried out by other means. The revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe, it has to be shook. Get a little further, you are too near me. We begged for life and the white man thought we wanted theirs. We heard the soldiers coming. They made us promises, many more than I can remember. But they never kept but one. They promised to take our land, and they did. As long as the grass grows and the water runs, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. With my own eyes I saw Spaniards cut off noses and ears of Indians, male and female, without provocation, merely because it pleased them to do so. Get a little further, you are too near me. I am poor and naked, but I am chief of this nation. We do not want riches, but we do want our children to be trained right. Riches would do no good. As long as the grass grows and the water runs, as the long-forgotten peoples of the respective continents rise and begin to reclaim their ancient heritage, they will discover the meaning of the land and their ancestors. Get a little further, you are too near me. The life of a single human being is worth 1,000,000 times more than all the property of the richest man on earth. The greatest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution which has to start within each of us. As long as the grass grows and the water runs, get a little further, you are too near me. So Raul always told me that practice is the only way to keep our identities alive. And to claim something as something like Xicanindio, which is really just a reconnecting to our native ancestry, our native roots, but not in the past, he made that clear. It's always about in the present. The native communities around you, the native peoples, and connecting between native and Chicano communities. It's a culture that we are trying to preserve, and we have to realize that culture is fluid and concepts that are and practice that must be changed according to the person. Deborah Miranda writes in her memoir, Bad Indians, culture is ultimately lost when we stop telling the stories of who we are, where we have been, how we arrived, what we once knew, what we wish we knew. When we stop retelling the past, our imagining of our future and the long, long task of inventing our identity, every single second of our lives will die. We all have Native and Latino blood in us. We first have to acknowledge this, then we have to acquaint ourselves with both histories. We have to involve. We must involve ourselves in Native communities. It's what's at the core component of behind many Chicano stories. Many connections between both cultures for me led me to the fact that I've always had Native practices in my life. My great-grandmother was a curandera in the town I grew up in. She was a neighborhood midwife. She used to get paid in chickens and goats, and she would bring them back to the house. My mother would tell me that this is how she would get paid. It was never money. It was always in things that the people would give to her. And she taught my mother lots of the old practices about how to heal using spider webs, using coke, using different things that you wouldn't think were possible. But my great grandmother never learned to read. She memorized all these practices, all these medicinal things, and she taught it to my mother. And my mother used them throughout her life. I just didn't realize it because she never really talked about what they were. They were just something they did, Just something that was part of who we were. But so the distinction must be that we must maintain these practices. We also regain them and realize what they are. The more we connect to who they are. So I'm going to end my presentation here with one last poem. And one of the things that runs through, let's skip to the end. Let's kind of skip through this whole thing. All right, there we go. That's actually the cover to my the book that I have coming out, which should be out this month. The rabbit runs through a lot of what I'm talking about. It runs through a lot of I guess, native stories is the trickster. The trickster, the rabbit becomes a trickster in a lot of Cherokee traditions. It certainly is, and so is in Nahuatl. It becomes the rabbit comes up a lot. So for me, it's always come up. So I'm assuming it's my spirit animal. I'm not sure, but it always comes up for me in one way or the other. In Cherokee, it's referred to as chistu. That's what the rabbit is, chistu. So this picture is actually a painting off of a photograph that hung in my grandfather's house that my wife did. Corina, she's sitting right there. It didn't actually have a rabbit in it, but this backyard is where I grew up, which is what my second book of poetry is really about. It's about, this backyard, there's my grandfather's lawnmower, the fence, everything. It kind of is my whole story in this one picture, but I needed the rabbit, so the rabbit is there, because it's kind of what pulls me through the journey. So this poem I'm going to read is called Trickster Got Tricked Blues, and this is kind of connecting these ideas together. There's going to be some Cherokee words in this, so when I go, I'll try and translate for you. All right. So Trickster Got Tricked Blues. Last night I dreamed of chicharas singing Salagi songs. Salagi is Cherokee, the word for Cherokee. Salagi songs on Mexica beaches, conches filled with uncooked Spanish rice, strapped together with fishing lines, singing of hummingbirds, dragonflies, and snakes, dancing together on the backs of turtle while Waya's coyote, bears and condors wait for their chances to strike, while offshore, simmering like a tin roof on a sunny day, men on ships wait for the trickster's song of a promised land, theirs for the taking. In the kiss of night on day I heard Salagi chicharas singing on Mexica beaches, crashing waves, keeping tempo like static from an old radio. Constant as slipping sands and covering ancient seashells, but out in the grass another tone is humming in the wind, low and quiet like a slithering snake or a silent prayer, calling to the waiting ships in the water with iron anchors. They listen to the hum sent by the trickster, promising new lands granted by God, theirs for the taking. In my dream, I heard these Salagi songs sung by Latinos on C.O.N.C.A beaches after ships dropped iron anchors, breaking rhythm like a guillotine, severing head from neck and song from singer, because trickster in his haste to have a world for his own did not think to make himself known to the men on these ships, so they wouldn't take him like they took the hummingbirds, the dragonflies, the snakes, and people of this land, so that they could have their promised land filled with God's milk and honey, and no natives nor their songs, certainly no trickster to sing in their ears. And as trickster lay turning on these men's spits, skinned and gutted and waiting to be eaten, the last sound he heard was the singing of chicharas, singing Salagi songs on Latino beaches. Thank you.
Very happy to be here today. I'm going to tell you about my journey as an immigrant in the US, and like most journeys, it starts with a word, volver. Volver in Spanish means to return, and it's an ever-present word in the lips of an immigrant. I know this because volver sprouts on my skin like a flower that grows without water. I am an immigrant writer. I divide and I multiply myself in this land that is so full of opportunities, but at the same time, I long for my volver, my return. As an immigrant, I've had a change in perspective 3 times, and I consider these changes the process of my immigrant identity and adaptation. I arrived to the US when I was 13 years old. I arrived as a visitor. I didn't feel the need to immerse myself into the new country and the new culture, or become part of this melting pot. My identity was defined. I was a Mexican visiting for a short period of time. I was 13 years old, and my little brother and little sister were 5 and 6, and they bonded right in, not me. For many years, I felt like that spare piece when you finish a puzzle. I couldn't relate to the people, that surrounded me, and I will ease these feelings of confusion, loneliness, and strangeness by holding tight to my volver. And let me share with you a poem that talks about these feelings. Volver es descubrir bajo la piel el rocío de una vegetación que se creía muerta. Es llegar y encontrarte corriendo por las calles y amar con locura lo que fuiste, y llenar con alevosía tus ojos hambrientos de recuerdos. Volver es embriagarte del aire hasta sentir los pulmones grandes como cerros y abiertos como ventanas en todas las casas en donde entras. Volver es abrazarte en los brazos de todos, es dormir y despertar sin miedo, es sentir tus orígenes sin miedo, ser tú la campana y hacer sonar con alegría y flores. Volver no es ir y regresar, es tejer un solo canto y vivir de nuevo. In this first stage, I try to maintain the purity of my identity by refusing to become part of the mainstream culture. I was always pushing and pulling until the strength to push and pull just left my body. Before admitting that I was far away from my desired land, I searched for a place to belong, and this is my second stage. After graduating from high school, I continued my education at the local community college. This was the first time that I genuinely embraced my situation. Not only was I an immigrant, I was an undocumented immigrant. I didn't have time to negotiate the terms of this reality. It just hit me dry and cold. I found a job, I started studying, and I tried to find my place. Writing poetry helped me become aware of my feelings of confusion. I was no longer a visitor, I was a resident. I became involved with many social groups that protested against unjust treatment of illegal immigrants, unfair wages, and other social issues. I was undocumented and fighting for justice. Let me share with you a poem that talks about the situation between the social aspect and my reality as an immigrant trying to keep my own language alive. Dos lenguas. Mi idioma es una pared pintada de obsesiones blancas y negras. Es una pared en un desierto. Aquí también hace mucho frío por las noches. Por el día se detienen a descansar algunos tristes pájaros. Mi idioma es una pared alzada sin fin, cuya sombra cae sobre mi sombra. Es una pared de huesos con coyunturas profundas, por donde pueden verse las realidades, buscando verte desarmado. Pero no ves tú ni la pared, ni los huesos, ni el desierto. Ajenos a ti son los tristes pájaros, mismos que son origen de mi idioma. Para ti no existe más que tu lengua, esa criatura fría que se adueña de todo territorio, una lengua agria que no conoce otro comienzo que su propia descendencia. Para ti solo existe tu lengua viperina, lengua de serpiente que ha buscado acorralarme desde el día que llegó a mi tierra y empezó a construir sobre mí esta pared que me ahoga. Tu lengua es la serpiente que busca por las calles, en las leyes, en las escuelas, encontrar mi lengua para cercenarla, para colocarla, para arrancar de tajo el único pedazo de mí que germina con el dulce canto de mi madre. Buscas, serpentina, mi lengua errante, mi lengua de necesidades básicas, mi lengua sumisa que solamente busca una tregua por las tardes, esas tardes que también piensas que son tuyas. Buscas mi lengua para arrancarla, para colocarla junto a todas las otras lenguas que has desarraigado. Mis hermanos ya no entienden mis canciones. No reconocen mi mano que sujetó su mano por siglos enteros y no puedo gritarles porque mostraría mi lengua desnuda y vulnerable y seguiría su olor de flores y tierra fresca. Mi idioma es una pared con la que has impuesto tu idioma. Cada piedra la colocaste con saña. Nuestras lenguas luchan en una superficie invisible. Mi lengua es la vida, que siembra cuidadosa por túneles secretos. Tu lengua me persigue carnívora. Mi lengua sobrevive. Mi lengua es la vida, arrullando a hijos y hermanos. Mi lengua es la vida, agua limpia que busca redimir tu opresión. Mi lengua es la vida. Hay un mar de paz del otro lado de esta pared. No tengas miedo. Mi lengua es la vida. Deep inside my heart, I was still searching for my place, because everyone has a place. And even though voicing my feelings through my poetry and participation in these groups made me feel better, didn't make me feel whole. I continued my education and received my bachelor's degree, and continued with my master's degree. I became an advocate for education. My husband and I started a program that focused on providing information to high school students about continuing their education regardless of their status, of their legal status. For this work, I received the National Gabriela Mistral Award, and something in me awakened. I discovered that my actions made a difference, that I was intrinsically part of this society. I discovered that we defined who we are with our actions and not with a label. The third stage in my journey is a reconciliation. I continue with my doctoral studies, and I provided a series of creative writing workshops to the community. I was still an undocumented immigrant until the beginning of this year, when I received a deferred action working permit. In the month of August, I was able to return to my homeland. 13 years had passed. The return was filled with excitement and fear. It took me 13 years to become part of this new culture that I was afraid that it meant I didn't have my place in my homeland. I feared that finding my place in this country meant that I no longer had my place in my homeland. And let me share with you a poem that I wrote when I was in Veracruz. So I didn't have a word to describe how I was feeling, right? Because I was who I was when I was in Veracruz, but in that moment, I was also somebody else that had to be in another country. And the only word that I could come up with is ser siendo. Ser and siendo, just put together. Fui gaviota extraviada creyendo que era ola desmedida. Llego a ti ser siendo, mostrándote mis palmas para que vuelas en ella la larga línea que no me dejaba volver. Llego a ti ser siendo, tratando de acomodarme en los rincones vacíos de tu malecón, esperando que en alguno de ellos me abras los brazos y embonar, pero no encuentro en ninguno mi medida. Vengo con el corazón desbordado, con la angustia de que no me reconozcas, que no hayas guardado mi lugar. La angustia me hizo llegar a ti ser siendo, bebiendo tu agua, llenándome del olor de toda tu tierra. Voy a tu mar para extraer las profundidades desbocadas que me han hecho tanta falta. Pero tú me miras como un abismo. Yo, que voy ser siendo ola desmedida, pensé que me reconocerías al verme, disfrutando de tu libamén, pero soy solo un huésped en tus calles, visitante oliendo tu humedad olvidada, acariciando tus muros con manos secas, probando con una lengua extranjera. Llego a ti ser siendo, segura de que todo me pertenece, de que todo vuelve a ser mío al verlo de nuevo, pero las dos hemos cambiado. Hundo mis pies en tu arena, me rindo. Tal vez he dejado en otro cascarón la sonrisa de la niña que habías bañado en tus aguas dulces. Llego a ti ser siendo, pero no me reconoces. no embono en tus árboles, no me mojan tus aguas, soy la desconocida. Mi voz no llegaba a ti desde esa celda que habitaba. No escuchaste el palpitar de mi corazón que te extrañaba, el palpitar que en un pasado había sido uno con tu selva. Todos los años que te extrañé fueron el eco en una vida lejana. Dejo caer de mis brazos tu tesoro, me rindo y suelto este cuerpo en tus calles. Solamente quiero que me reconozcas. Debajo de ese almendro se esconde una niña y al verla tenemos los mismos ojos. Volví a ti cerciendo, sin saber que irse y volver son el mismo encuentro. Volver in Spanish means to return. And even though we'll go back to Mexico many more times, for an immigrant, solamente vuelves una vez. We only return once. And it is in this volver, in this reconciliation, that we discover the true richness of our identity. We are the sum of our experiences, longings, our actions, and our passions. I was able to return to my homeland as a visitor, and I found my place intact. What a wonderful feeling. I came back to the US because I belong here. I have a purpose. Soy de aquí y soy de allá.
Olin is the Nahuatl word for movement. Movement that is earth-shaking or that produces change. This movement, this Chicano movement, is headed in a fluidity of the self. The definition of the movement is one of returning to the idea of movement as a means of regeneration and a means of seeking perfection. I want to ask people, what do you think Nezahualcóyotl, the Texcocan poet king, Josh Waitzkin, the chess master, and of course Bruce Lee have in common? Anybody?
They were good at what they did. I don't know.
Chris said earlier that they all have in common that they're in this presentation, so that's very, very right on. Okay, how can I go back on this?
Arrow back.
Arrow back.
Go back.
Look for the arrow button down in the right-hand corner.
Technology, man. So, what they have in common is that these three individuals that I just, admire and study, share certain things in common. First of all, they were martial artists, or are. Josh is still alive. Secondly, they achieved perfection in their particular trait. Josh is a master chess player, world renowned. Bruce Lee, obviously, the master of all martial artists. Nezahualcóyotl, the greatest politician, poet of ancient Mexico. But they achieved this. They achieved this because they all three embraced change. They all talk about it. They all reject the static comfort that comes with being, conforming oneself to the same idea or clinging to things. Nezahualcóyotl, I don't want to quote the whole thing, but in the top it says, we will pass away, not forever on earth, only a brief time here. within that message is the idea of embrace the fact that we all go through this stage. This is just a stage in our growth. Life is just another step. It's not something to cling on to. It's not something to, cry about when you go or when others go. It's just evolution. Josh, part of his quote says, not to live in the pursuit of excellence. The key to pursuing excellence is to embrace organic, long-term learning process, not to live in a shell of static, safe mediocrity. Bruce Lee, life itself is your teacher, and you are in a state of constant learning. When you're in a state of constant learning, that in itself, by definition, implies change, right? You keep learning new things, you keep growing. You don't stay static in one place. That's the only way to achieve perfection in anything. And Aslan, it's more of a metaphorical place than anything, but we do and are populating this area just by the very process of human movements, across the earth. And supposedly, according to some traditions, Aslan was situated somewhere in the north, modern-day Mexico, and the peoples traveled down in search of a prophecy of an eagle perched on a cactus. But I interpret that as people in search of change, in search of expanding the proclivities of their identities. And of course, what that brought about was, one of the greatest civilizations in the century, in Mesoamerica, Tenochtitlan and all the neighboring cultures that arose in the Valley of Mexico. I introduced this because I wrote an essay that I would like to share that it speaks of this change that I'm talking about. And these individuals and this idea of Aslan and the migration that now has turned upwards north, again back to Aslan, is an indication of what this change is all about. This constant search for that elusive identity that we are, in search of. But that identity should remain something that is something that we are in pursuit of. It's like trying to catch the wind. If you were to be able to stop it, then you stop the winds of the earth. So change is something that we should, and in identity, as far as what we're talking about, that's what we are seeking, to constantly be in search of this, to constantly be evolving this identity. This is called Chicano emotion. The Chicano rises like a phoenix out of the ashes of conflicts past. He has heard the calling of the mestizo races, Latin Americans, Hispanic Americans, North, Central, South Americans, whose veins carry the flow of Indio blood tinged with European strains. He calls his brothers and sisters. A Chicano whose face is new upon the land is searching for an identity all his own. For the Indio, though he may be subdued, he has inherited eons of American experience. The European needs not to grapple with the question of being either, but the mestizo, with the Chicano as its central spokesperson in the U.S., is tasked to investigate every and all pathways that lead to the formation of the self. Therefore, the Chicano seeks. He is a student of life. The Chicano creates. He is the mirror to his people. The Chicano manifests. He carries the heritage of the mestizo masses to the center stage and exalts it, yet does not deify it. I'm showing these pictures here. I will explain. In seeking one is poised to find what is being sought, yet the end is not the aim. For it is purposeless to find an identity then cease our search, but we must find it and proceed to push the boundaries of their proclivity until they break and allow yet another stage of evolution. It is only by these means that the peoples of the earth have made their marks in history. The forefathers of the original Chicanos, the Mexica, rose to prominence and fame throughout the world from a point of near insignificance. Every people have had such origins and made their mark, but the impact of their feats was due to the actions of individuals. The Chicano individual, as a proponent of the masses, makes inroads into this territory by his constant search within himself and without, be it through a formal education, taking on a profession and injecting his unique cultural background and perspective, or as an orator whose purpose is the empowerment of the meek. In this search, the Chicano is not limited in his manifestations. He is the proper English-speaking citizen concerned with the task of procuring the daily bread. Yet at night he is like a hound whose thirst is unquenchable and who howls at the moon as his passions unfold, leading to frenzies of the flesh through dance, drink, dialogue, a sudden scuffle, and lovemaking. He is a teacher in the classrooms and a teacher in the streets talking Galo slang and Spanglish. He is the social worker helping you feed your kids. He is the poet working his beats on the mic. The spirit of the old America seeps out through his skin and his tongue, and yet he holds dear the gods of the old world in prayer every night and upon waking as well. For the values of our daily life are ruled by those of whom have written our history since the old world made the new, such as the value of money and the obsession to own pieces of the land which is sovereign and cannot be owned in spite of our claims to it. Deforestation. As a creator, the Chicano is a poet no longer confined to the lines upon the fields of America's cornucopia. He now confines himself to the lines he creates upon blank pages, lines of fruit sown by his hand which feeds his fellow's hunger, not in the stomach but of the mind and soul. Through the endeavor of poetics, the Chicano seeks to present the nature of his current status in the land and help his people see themselves in him, appreciate themselves through his deeds, and exalt themselves through pride in their uniqueness. It is this role as a projector of images, reflector of those faces cast upon him from the vast array of mestizo variety, that allows him the flexibility to be this and that, but neither at the same time. From the Latin Americas and from the US, and yet neither from here nor there. For unlike Indios and Europeans, the mestizo Chicano is not confined to lands by borders, but may be confined to the land by ties that bind much stronger, the ties of love. The love of family is the focal point of the Chicano priority. Every day that allows time to celebrate, the Chicano does so in haste, for he is reminded constantly that life is ethereal, it is not eternal. He is reminded by the poems dated hundreds of years old in the mouth of the poet king Nezahualcóyotl. He is reminded by the grandfathers who speak of hard times and death because of poverty and illness. Therefore, the Chicano celebrates and thumbs his nose at death, but in the morning he thanks God for the life that he has been given. Therefore, the Chicano creates another poem and another stilt upon which he rests the weight of his people's cosmos. Among the stars of this cosmos lay the ancestors of the Chicano. They hailed from many a tradition, many a faith, many a manifestation of old and new, different and the same. The Chicano is in constant motion because so many essences course through him, dictating wants and needs, and he listens to all and to none and he does what he wants because he is free. He follows the decree of float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, be one yet be another and still be one and the same. As a Chicano, the aim is to promote the mestizo heritage from all walks of the Latin and Native Americas. To promote is to exalt, but to exalt our varied heritage must not mean to confine the self, but be used as another step upon which to rest on our progressive climb out of an undefined identity. For though our respective backgrounds may be clearly defined and our fathers and mothers educate us in their ways, it is the individual's involvement in the realm of the U.S. prominent majority that constantly churns out newer values and perspectives for the Chicano as a mestizo descendant and as a person unhinged by the dogma of our past and the oppressiveness and stagnating effects of a forced Americanization. It is this love of change and motion that will lead to the Chicano to all manner of unpredictable manifestations of the self. It is the sense of freedom to be, as Ralph Waldo Emerson celebrated, which gives the Chicano his depth. It is the freedom this freedom that characterizes me. I am Chicano. That's just Intan, my idol. And I want to close this by thanking everybody for being here and for letting us come in here and present. And I want to introduce now my other colleague, El Pocho Máximo, Isaac Chavarria.
El gran pocho.
Hey everybody, let me just get set up. So I'm talking about being pocho, right? So on the first slide, we'll see that I have Hispanic, Chicano, okay, right? Because when I was going to graduate school for my MFA at UT Pan American, which is in Edinburgh, South Texas, right? I was asked, okay, well, how are you identifying, right? And I had to really think about that question because in South Texas, the word or the term Chicano is not widely used. So I was like, okay, you know, I didn't feel Chicano enough to call myself Chicano, right? And then if I call myself Hispanic, people would be like, no, you shouldn't call yourself Hispanic. Or like, so you tell me I can't call myself Hispanic, and I don't feel like I should call myself Chicano, so what do I call myself, right? And I did put those definitions there, right? And I put those definitions there because I want to see how, like in Hispanic, it says, uses of Hispanic presuppose a homogeneous, meaningful, and identifiable Hispanic sector. And then it talks about essentially how it seems to avoid all those other factors. Regional location, familiar migration. You know, that's what the term Hispanic seems to be saying according to this writer. And then in Chicano, it says the term announced a break along generational and inspirational lines between Mexican American student and worker activist and older Mexican Americans. And what I didn't like about that definition is that it says it announced a break, right? A break between a generation and between the young and the old, right? So I didn't feel like that concept of break was something that I wanted to kind of like display, right? So I looked into I was doing research and then I came upon the word pocho, right? So let's see. So now the word pocho, if you don't know the word pocho, is not the best word you want to call yourself in most cases, right? Because it's a pejorative term, right? It's an insult, right? If you call yourself pocho, it's an insult, right? And the definition has changed throughout time. So I put up two definitions there, 1949 and 1965. Usually the term is referring to a dialect. It can also be referring to being Americanized, right? And Americanized in the bad way, not the good way, right? Meaning you lose your culture, you lose your language, you know, you're not Mexican anymore, you're a pocho, right? That's what when we call it pocho, that's what they're trying to say, right? And so I thought about that, right? I thought about the reality of like being Americanized. The fact that I did grow up in the United States, right? So in some form or another, I was gonna be Americanized, right? And so that's what I started to do when I started thinking about the word pocho, about its meanings, about how it really shows change, right? And that's what I was starting to like about the word pocho, the concept of change, right? So, but I was aware of the definitions, so it's not like I just completely was oblivious of what pocho meant, right? So then people really started kind of questioning like, well, okay, you're gonna call yourself pocho, why are you gonna call yourself pocho, right? We got Chicano, we got Latino, we got American, we got Hispanic, we got bunch of other stuff, right? Why Tejano, why are you gonna call yourself pocho? Why are you gonna try and add in something else? Well, my respuesta, my answer was like, you know, other identities reflect common bonds, right? But one of the things that I still feel as an individual, right? I still feel displaced, right? I still feel displaced in where I live. Even though I can consider myself American, I know, I'm somewhat accepted by American society, but I know for sure that I'm not a part of the larger American society, right? And the same thing when I'm Mexicano, with Mexicanos, right? I'm not part of their society. Chicanos, activists, in my own ways, I think I am an activist, but even in that sense, as a Chicano, right? I don't feel like I'm part of that. So I feel this large displacement with a lot of the groups that I may sometimes talk to, right? And so I like the concept of the divergence of Pocho as a modern, regional, and also unapologetic, right? And you'll see why it's unapologetic in a little bit. Okay. All right. So, of course, in my definition, in my eyes, there's a lot of things that can make up a Pocho, right? But so I selected a few: influence, perception, anti-héroe, religion, preguntas. So I decided to use those in order to reflect what a Pocho is. And if you see some similarities to a Chicano, it's okay, right? People have like common bonds, so some of these may seem familiar. All right. So just to give you some background, I come from Hidalgo County, which is a county made up of a whole bunch of cities, which the population is about, let's say, 800,000, right? From those 800,000, 90% are Hispanic, Latino, Mexican descent, right? Right next to Hidalgo County, right, is Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Mexico. And they have a population of, let's say, like 600,000, right? So when I'm talking about influence, that's my influence, right? We're talking about an area that's 90% of Mexican descent, right? So even though there is some American influence, a lot of the influence is a different type, right? Not only Mexican, right? Because sometimes we think of the concept of Mexico, right? But we're talking about people from Latin America as well, and other ethnicities, right? So that's the type of influence I'm starting to get, right? Not just the Mexican influence. All right. And I don't think the audio is working because I forgot to request audio, I think. But we'll give it a shot, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
I think it should work.
Yeah? Let's see. No.
We can give it a shot, though. Hang on.
Okay. Please hold.
Do you want to stop it?
It's a short video, so. Does anybody recognize that individual? That's. Oh, yeah. This is Calle 13. So one of the things I did want to talk about was about how this influence, right, is not just coming from my region. My region that is 90% Mexican American or Mexican descent, right? My influence is starting to become a worldwide influence, right? So this is showing a little bit of the modern concept, right? Where you're not just being influenced by, your ancestry. You're starting to be influenced by different cultures, by different ideas. And then as you take those ideas in, as I take these ideas in, I have to start thinking and questioning.
There you go. You go sound now.
Yeah, whenever you're ready.
Okay, stop talking. I have to start questioning, okay, how are these cultures influencing my own ideas? How are they adding to it, right? And how could I just not ignore them, right? Because I'm not trying to ignore them. I'm trying to make them a part of me, right? So this concept is starting to be a Pocho concept. It's starting to be this worldwide acceptance. And so these are just lyrics. So I just wanted you to hear Calle 13 in case you haven't heard Calle 13.
Un discurso político sin saliva, las caras más bonitas que he conocido, soy la fotografía de un desaparecido, la sangre dentro de tus venas, soy un pedazo de tierra que vale la pena una canasta con frijoles, soy Maradona contra Inglaterra, anotándote 2 goles.
And I like Calle 13 because they talk about Latin America, and they talk about, I guess what you would call the working class, right? So they talk about things. And if you know some of their other songs, they talk about other stuff too, right? But, that's one of the things I enjoy also, that it's not just like rooted in one idea. They have numerous ideas.
You should hit the space bar.
Okay. Let's see. So I'm going to read a short poem because most of my poems are really short, right? Talking about, well, sort of talking about that influence, because it's also like the American and the Mexican American. So this poem is called Un Mix de Historia, and it's about Little Red Riding Hood, but in here her name is Caperucita Roja, which is just a translation. Un Mix de Historia. I met Caperucita Roja con su tasty pasteles, a clean-cut niña going to abuela's house. Esa niña roja, unaware of a dancing devil en el baile, hoof steps waking borrachos, y la lechuza, perched on a huizache, screeching at love making silhouettes. Cuidado, Little Red Riding Hood, do not dance with a handsome stranger, do not steal your neighbor's husband. All right. So if you saw some of that, you saw some of the like the huizache, the dancing devil, which are, you know, stories from Mexican American, right? Okay, so another thing about the influence is also the perception, right? That's the other thing I wanted to talk about, the perception. Because pochos, again, in most times are not perceived in a positive way. They're perceived as losing language. If you lose language, you lose culture, and it's pretty much almost saying like you're dumb, right? So let me show you this video.
Kevin says pocho. Kevin is pocho. No hablo muy bien español. I don't know. Pero conoce mucho de México.
You know, I remember being called a pochito, I think, but I would wonder because my Spanish was pretty good. I mean, Spanish is my first language. They thought I was the world's biggest pocho, and I was like, you know, I haven't even opened my mouth yet.
All right. So then we're talking about how being pocho is usually portrayed in that sense, right? But pochos do know things, right? I can agree with them because I speak Spanish, right? But my Spanish is not at the level of like Castilian Spanish. It's not like Mexican Spanish. I know Valley Spanish, Rio Grande Valley Spanish, right? So I know some Tex-Mex. I know a couple words of Payujo. You know, I know things that can help me survive where I'm from, right? And I think that is the important concept, that my language for where I'm from serves me well, right? Rather than trying to say that I'm trying to meet standards from another location. I'm trying to meet standards from a different region, from a different lifestyle. No, for my lifestyle, my Spanish serves me well, and my knowledge serves me well. Right? Okay, this is one of my favorite ones, all right? This is where it gets serious. All right, so the other concept is the anti-héroe, right? The anti-hero, right? I started reading these Chicano novels, and these were strong characters or things doing things for the community, and like it was awesome stuff, right? And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, like these are high standards, and I'm thinking about who I know, who I live with, my father, and all these concepts, and also like their influences, right? And so when I started thinking about that, I was like, you know, in my poetry, in myself, I create a different character, right? And this character has flaws. This character is not perfect. And that's who I want the pocho to be. That's who I want to be as a pocho, right? Accepting of my flaws, right? Trying to correct them sometimes, right? But accepting my flaws and realizing that not always perfect. And I have, this is C.O.N.C.A, in case you don't know C.O.N.C.A, right? C.O.N.C.A, well, he can speak for himself, right?
Ay, usted disculpe. ¿Por qué no se fija por dónde camina? Perdóneme. ¿Perdóneme? ¿Por qué se me echa encima? Se me salió. Se salió. Chica banquetota y no cabe. Perdóneme. Pues, perdóneme. Abusa nada más porque soy pobre. ¿Qué, güey? Babos. Perdone, señorita.
Skips.
¿Qué oble? Soy Juan Camaney. Bailo tango, masco chicle, pego duro, tengo viejas de un montón.
Right? So that's how it goes, right? And so you've seen like what he was doing at the beginning. He bumped into this gentleman and he stole his wallet, right? And then he bought himself some breakfast. And then while he was buying some breakfast, he saw this young lady, and then he decided to go talk to her, right? You know, that usually is not the type of character you emulate, right? But as a pocho, my father would see these movies, right? Because they represented something that was him, that was more him. He was working class, right? The important things that are to take from this video is that he felt that he was poor and that people would judge him because he was poor, right? And so C.O.N.C.A does a lot of different films. If you haven't seen Las Risas en Vacaciones, it's like a comedy, like a gag comedy show or movie. Those are funny as well, right? But these are the characters that I wanted to represent in my poetry, but also as part of my identity, right? The sense of like a working class individual, right? But let's go back, or let's stay there, right? Because I'm gonna read a poem. And this poem, it kind of goes into the concept of like considering identity and looking at different, I guess, viewpoints of these identities. Contemplating. Cultural icons under a microscope. C.O.N.C.A, sexist or blue collar, switch. Edward James Olmos, pioneer or Mexicano stereotype, switch. Raul Salinas, cellmate or poet, switch. Selena, idol or adulteress, switch. Alton, Texas, Barrio Colonia or dumping ground, switch. Las Cumbres, Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Mexico, sister city or tribal advisory, switch. Pocho, identity or identidad, switch. Frontera to border zone, switch. Pocho to Chicano to Hispanic y back, switch. Hasta cuando I'm topsy-turvy y ni sé dónde estoy or which cultura I speak. Okay, all right, that was a point to the other one. So then the other thing I'm also liking to talk about is religion, right? La manera que nos criaron, the way we were raised. So I was raised Catholic. As you can see, this is documentation of my Catholic background, right? My sister doing a dance for the church. My nephew, I think, being baptized by my father, my mom, and my brother, the dark one, right? So that was church. Well, turns out like when I was like 12 or 13 years old, I just kind of decided to stop going to church. I was like, I don't want to go, right? I just hid in bed and hoped my mom wouldn't make me go to church. And from that day on, she didn't make me go to church. I don't understand why, right? Because my mom goes to church like every week. And the longer I spent away from church, the less I started believing, right? And so I believed less. And then, you know, that's how I lived, right? And then I went again studying the Chicano poetry, Chicano history, and I saw many of these images of La Virgen, los curanderos, right? All these images like really relying heavily on Catholicism and religion, right? And then I was thinking, what if I don't believe, right? If I don't believe, what happens to these images, right? I understand them. I know the history, right? But what do they mean to me, right? So I started thinking about that. And I wrote a poem about that as well. Being a non-believer in Mexican American means. Being a non-believer in Mexican American means only attending mass in case of firstborn baptisms, quinceañeras, and emergency weddings. It's true. It means 100 pairs of crossed fingers, naming Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. A non-believer kneels and holds back hands. The repetition, Amen, 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 y mujeres. Curanderos, power derived from Dios, are deaf and mute. Promesas, in the name of el Padre and in death. For a non-believer, La Virgen de Guadalupe will never appear. Palm Sunday, Ash Wednesday, Good Friday. To be godless almost means not being Chicano. So that's not poem. Okay. So my last point is the concept of questions, right? Questions that a poacher might have. Questions that we may have anyways, right? So what I've done here is I enjoy doing like these random projects. And one of the concepts of questions is also about the influence, right? So you should all know who Selena is, right? The famous singer.
Maybe.
Died. Well, was murdered, not died, right? In Texas, icon, like music icon. And she's almost become a saint, I think, right? Which I'm fine with. Because I love Selena, and I used to sing Selena songs when I was small, right? I'm kind of weird like that. Right? So I thought Selena is a very important character, somebody I admire, somebody who's important. But then I had this question, what if Selena had lived, right? How would this world have changed? How would this concept of Chicano, concept of poch has changed, right? And, I write poetry, and I think that's a good way to ask questions, but I thought also, I want to be more artistic. I did not draw this, right? I paid somebody to draw this. I told them, this is what I want, can you draw it? And they drew this, right? And they did awesome work. But, that's one of the things that I want to be represented more, that there are questions. We should ask questions, right? Questions about things, what if this would have happened? Or, what if we change? What if we, I don't know. Well, what if we read this poem that I wrote, all right? And sometimes that can be like not so serious, right? So some of these questions are not so serious, but they're still questions. Poetry questions. Why can't I roll my R's when Andrea La Huera can? ¿Y por qué Tesalónica se convirtió en Tessie? When did the Pulga become ghetto? What is the equivalent of Bob in Spanish? I don't know the question. I knew the answer once, but then I forgot. Were you always that brown? How do I sound when I speak Espanol? Quinceañeras, baptisms, and weddings count as attending church, right? How do you say happy hour in Spanish? Is it Holmes or Holmes? And si me voy, can I come back? All right. So that's the end of my presentation. That's me as a pocho.
Ask questions,
And
Okay.
now you're more than welcome to hear Jerry.
Yeah. Now we'll have a question and answer session. Well, thank you very much, Nigel. Really appreciate it. We'll have a question and answer session at this time. We welcome any questions from the audience, and trust me, they love questions, so please let them have it.
Please let them have it. Oh my God. Tear us down. Just so you know, my book is on sale. If you want to buy my book.
Yes, go ahead.
First, I want to thank you for coming today. This was a really moving presentation, and although you're all representing different identities, the way you all speak together and the way it comes together is really, really beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about C.O.N.C.A and how you formed this coalition and why you chose to do this and your mission? And
Sure. C.O.N.C.A started as, well, what ended up happening is three of us got put on the same panel. We're at the Glorians conference. When was it?
A year ago, I think.
May
No, it was longer than a year ago because they go every 18 months before that conference.
18 months.
Yeah, because we just had one, so the one before. We got put on the panel. We all did our little separate presentations, and we realized we're all asking the same questions. And so after that, we kind of started talking about where the movement stood at this point and what we're all doing. Because I think one of the things that we start to recognize is that, and what I started to recognize when I started to do research on this is, there's nothing really being written about what happens since 2001, really, since 9/11. There's no really any articles out there about the history of what's happened in the past 12 years. And really since about 2008, there's been a lot of activity in the poetry community. And so we started to bring this all together and start to really bring all of us and try to ask these questions. So the first things we did for about a year was really just hold roundtables where we just asked questions of everybody we went to see. And that's really where it started. It was all about asking questions. And so we started to develop different things. And we started to talk to lots of different writers and poets and artists and activists, and really started to form where we all stood in this and how we can kind of promote this idea that the Chicano movement is not I guess has never been dead, but it always evolves, it always changes with the people who are kind of taking on the banner. So this is kind of how we all started. There's a lot of things that, especially in times of political upheaval things, especially recently, that's when the poetry and the arts and all these really take a forefront. In this case, we have a lot of it. If you're all familiar with the Libro Traficante movement with Tony Diaz, poets responding to SB 1070 is a big one. Francisco Alarcón. New Mexico has a huge scene. El Paso. We talked to lots of these different peoples and we're starting to connect to these communities, and a lot of them are working toward trying to really repeal a lot of these xenophobic laws that are being passed. And so it's really just started that way, and we started to present together, and that's kind of how it came together, and we started to think about how we can help the community. And so we want to take our message to the schools. We've gone to high schools, and try to talk to them about different identities, so we can start at a different. And this is kind of where we've done lots of different things, but I don't know if anyone wants to talk.
And I think to me what's very important about this group is even though we have a message of diversity, each of us has our different identities, what we're trying to project is unity. It means even though we have different identities, we can be one and work as one for a very important purpose.
You guys got questions?
Yeah, there are questions. There are specific authors. Anything about their works? Any poems? Anything that stood out to you?
I'm just gonna add more to my presentation. Okay, so my whole concept of poch is that I'm trying to redefine it, right? To make it mean something good. And what I also do is poch is usually spelled P-O-C-H-O, right? But I'm spelling it P-O-X-O, kind of like, adding that X as that variable, that factor of like influence, right? And also sometimes because, the X is like, if you say Chicano, then you can spell it with an X. So I wanted to spell poch with an X also. Anybody want to add to the presentation? We have a question. Yes.
Do you find Chicano to be a bit exclusive to those who don't identify with it? And how do you think that the organization is more inclusive of other identities aside from sexuality and ethnicity?
You mean even identities across the board, like
global?
Yeah. Well, actually, that is part of what we're addressing too. Kind of like looking at a more global community. But the main message is rooted in the connection between people of Hispanic or Latino background and Native American, right, background. So we all, like here on this panel, share that. We all have Indio blood in us. We all have some strains of European blood too. We recognize that. And I think the way that we are promoting, or we are addressing the idea of a more global, outreach is by acceptance of differences in people, groups, just because we share this common identity thread of, Indio blood and European, culture. We don't want to exclude ourselves from a greater community because we're all part of that greater community called, humanity, right? And we tend to, or I think groups tend to do that, right? To coalesce, right? They become, they form into this identity, this established, self, and then, that's where you get the us versus them, right? This is us versus, that's the outsiders or whatever, the other. And that's what we're talking about, like in my essay, that's what I'm talking about too. Like, I'm talking within the context of his Latino slash Native American identity, but fluid identity that embraces change coming from anywhere, not just from within the movement itself, not just from within my culture itself, because then that would not produce change. Eventually it's gonna reach a point where it cannot produce anymore, because if it's confined to certain limits, you know, oh, that's not Chicano enough, or that's not Latino enough, or that's not Native American enough, you know, then I can't really invest time into it. I wouldn't, you know, we're not preaching that, you know. We're preaching the reverse of that, which is embrace all change that comes, you know. The reason I put in my presentation that image of Germán Valdez, Tintan, I don't know if you're familiar with that. He was a Mexican actor from the 40s, the golden age of Mexican cinema. The reason I put him there is not just, you know, really not, I didn't really have time to go into it, but really it was because he was such a versatile artist, actor, singer, just a complete, well-rounded artist. The reason that he was such a well-rounded artist, you know, he reached the perfection, right, was because he was so open-minded about embracing all cultures. You know, he traveled everywhere. You know, he traveled to you know, Latin America, to Europe, everywhere, and just consumed cultures, and just brought him back. And you should check out those films. He you know, he'll act like a French, you know, person, and you know, like it's you know, it's within a comedy context, right? But he has the language, you know, he mimics the language, the patterns, you know, or you know, he'll bring back a character like a Spanish character, you know. It's a more of a cartoonish, right, aspect, you know, or a portrayal. But that's the point, you know, like he would embrace and consume, you know, these cultures and just bring them back and introduce something new to the masses, which is, you know, his audience, you know. And that's why his films are so popular even now that he's, you know, they're 50, 60 years old already, you know, those films. So that's what I mean, like that's the way to bridge those gaps, you know, like you were talking about, not becoming a exclusive kind of like, you know, group, but open to all groups, to all influences, to all people, you know. Anybody interact?
Question in the back. I have a slightly different question, and if you've already answered this, please excuse me because I came in a little bit late. In the beginning of the fall, there was an article that I think came out of UCSD that they were having a problem recruiting students to their Chicano studies programs because they don't identify as Chicanos anymore. And it wasn't even clarified within the article, what do they identify themselves as, and how does that then begin to reflect these great, you know, halls such as this of, you know, repositories of Chicano history, Latino history, with the youth today, if they don't feel that they're connected. I mean, and we're in the midst of it right now. I mean, that article was for the incoming freshmen for this, you know, fall 2013.
Well, that's kind of, I don't think we'd answered that yet. Chicano has always been a contentious term. People are afraid of the term because it's a political term. It's always been a political term. That's why we use it, because it does always bring up conversations. People always ask, why do you call yourself Chicano? You know, how are you connecting to that? Well, that's what starts a conversation. But the reason that people haven't been identifying with it, I think, is because it's seen in a couple different ways. One is it's seen as the 60s, right? It's seen as something that came out of the 60s and that type of a movement. And coming from us, you know, we're removed from that. We're 40 years removed from that movement. So how are we going to connect with those ideas, right? But the truth is that a lot of those things have evolved and they've changed and they're still out there. But we just haven't been teaching it that way. We've been teaching it as this was what happened in the 60s, the Chicano movement. And then after that, we have something else, right? And we haven't taught it or connected it as one long movement, one long civil rights movement, as Donidia says. Which it is. It's all part of the same thing. So I don't think it's being taught to the children. And I think a lot of this happens at the younger ages where it kind of gets erased out. This gets put in a box, right? Chicano was the 60s. We're not going to talk about it anymore. So they're not going to identify with that term. So kind of what we're doing is saying that Chicano is a living, breathing thing that's never gone away. But it always has to have a political aspect, which is what it's always been rooted in. And I think that's maybe what's going on there. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I guess if we asked them what they identified as, that might clear up some things. But I mean, that's one of those important questions that we're trying to a lot of times they just don't know the history. And the recent history has really been, for me and for all of us, about what's happening with the Chicano movement is just not being taught as much. I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening right now. And I mean, Arizona has been the kind of the big focus for right now because of everything that's happened over there. But it's happening in Texas, it's happening in California, it's happening all over the place. I mean, these type of laws to get it in the textbooks are a big one. Erasing that type of history from the textbooks is a very big deal because that's where they start to learn is at the younger ages. I don't know if that answers anything.
Yeah, I mean, it appears to me that it's just a common problem, and it's not just a California issue.
No, it's not.
It's kind of a global issue, and I work with a cross group of, all ages, from, kindergarten through college. Yeah. And it's just interesting that I'm beginning to hear that more frequently, is, well, am I a Chicano? And it's like, well, if you're asking, you probably don't know what it really means. Yeah. But I'm a little concerned that I feel that there might be a drifting away, and not intentionally, but more that that at the earlier ages, when students are beginning to make these decisions to go to college, that those opportunities in schools have not been presented to them, so that they have a choice, so they have an understanding of what they might then go into. Yeah. And it's not till they maybe get to the university, they're in something else, and then happen upon the Chicano Studies programs.
First of all, thank you for that question. That's a very interesting and poignant point. I think what you're talking about is people not really having, like I said, like you said, a sense of what Chicano is, or and not really also having a means to get that kind of sense of what it is, because if like Chris was saying, if you look into, like, let's say, search on Google or something, what Chicano is, they'll give you right away, the 1960s, definition of Chicanismo and all that, and all you see is all these old, pictures and old publications from the 60s and 70s, but it's portrayed as something that, okay, that was, it was alive at some point, and now it's not really, you don't really see it, and when you go into institutions of higher learning and you read about it or you learn about it in that way, like it's something that it's in the past, it's dead, or it's something had happened, it already has it had its starting point and its ending point, but it didn't really happen like that, but that's the way it's portrayed. That's part of I think the problem, because when we've done the roundtable discussions, we've had people there that were either from Puerto Rico, background, Puerto Ricanos, Cubanos, other people of different identities, right, different backgrounds, not necessarily Mexicanos, because that's what usually you think about, right? Chicano movement or Chicano, the sense of Chicano is more tied with Mexico or Mexican Americans. So these people, once we started talking about like what we're talking about, like the different aspects of what it is to be a modern day Chicano, right? The new wave of Chicanismo is, or Chicano with the at symbol, right? Including male, female, is that it's an open-mindedness. It's sharing various aspects of a culture that is rooted in European and native backgrounds, and that doesn't necessarily pertain only to Mexican Americans anymore. We're a bigger community, way bigger, and we've always really, always known it. It's just that we've never had the means to really communicate that with each other. Nowadays, though, one of the things that we're also talking about is that now with the internet, with social networking and other means of communication, people, ideas are merging faster. People are coming into like greater understanding through those means, right? So I think that's what is facilitating that. But what we need to do is to continue doing this sort of thing, where we do like we go into high schools or other scenarios where we speak to the younger crowds, younger generations and talk to them about what it is now to be Chicano, not what it was, you know? Not that you completely dispel or, you know, discredit or you know, don't give credit to what it was then, but don't get attached to what it was then, you know? Live in the now and embrace whatever changes come, right? And I think that would attract a lot more attention from younger generations, I think.
You said that Chicano studies is being taught from like a more objective perspective at the institution, as far as Chicano being something that existed in the past. Yeah, that's true. That's the way we're learning here at UCLA. And that's important to be conscientious of because ultimately, like you had said, if we are definitive in life, we stop learning. And Chicano is a category. It's a barrier between other folks, and despite whether you continue using it or not, it's still going to create boundaries with other individuals because it is something definitive, and that's kind of like paving a monolithic life to continue to exist within that historical context. And living in the new generation, it's not so much that Mexican Americans are ignoring it or moving away from it. It's just that we can't learn if we continue the same route. So Chicano studies is still something that the new generation is learning from because there's just so much richness in culture, and it's something that has existed and will continue to exist as far as like the foundation of our homes and, you know, where we come from. And ultimately identity is self-constructed. And so the categories are just social constructs, and the categories are also what are creating these delineations and borders.
Well, I totally agree with you, and personally I also wanted to add to the other question. It was very hard for me also at the beginning to label myself as a Chicano when I first started at the university, because I write in Spanish, and most of these Chicano magazines, they publish works in English that have words in Spanish, but not all in Spanish. I've always been very attracted to the social issues and social activism, so I consider myself to fit that specific characteristic of the Chicano movement, but I couldn't fit into some other characteristics. So it was very hard for me to bond with this label. But now with this group, what we're doing, and as my friends have mentioned, we're not defining Chicano. We are just adding into the meaning of what it is. And I really like how you expressed this identity that we're constantly making our identity, and that's what we're trying to do. For example, to me as an immigrant, I think I'm an immigrant, I'm a Chicana, okay, but I'm so many other things. Also, as a linguist, I can see, I had a research project, and I needed to ask the people, what do you consider yourself? Are you a Mexican? Are you a Mexican American? I included, are you a Chicano? And things like that. And some of the people whom I asked if you consider yourself a Chicano, that were like 30s and 40s, would say, no, that's negative, that's bad. I won't consider myself Chicano, of course I don't. So we can see that every generation has a different understanding of what the term means. But what is very important, and it's, I think, the root of the Chicano movement is action. Okay, we need to define it by acting, by doing things, by showing what it means, not just by saying what it means.
Go ahead.
Well, I just want to thank you for your work. I think it speaks to sort of the reality of the kind of the kind of world we're living in, particularly even in this country. I think some of the stuff that you're mentioning in Arizona and the Tea Party, and just the whole ripping away of anything that's not like white male entitlement. Like it's just the reality of it. And I just think that, you know, I agree with you in the sense of like this is a way of really going up against all of that. You know, as a way, which some of what you're mentioning about going up against the action, or how you're describing it. I did have a question, which, you know, I've been on this campus building for film screenings of BA Speaks Revolution, Nothing Less. And there's by Bob Vivekian, there's a question which I think ideologically is whether wanting in or wanting out. And I think in particular, even around like, look, you know, I'm a even around, like, say, for example, the DREAM Act or things like that, yes, it's the particularities of things, but what is being cohered ideologically? And so I don't know if you have some thoughts on that, and, you know, since that's something that it seems, any of you, since that's something that it seems like you've been more sort of on the ground or in the pace of.
Yeah, I think coming from a cultural rhetoric point of view, one of the traps we try to avoid is dictating what it means, right? What does it mean to be Chicano? When we're talking about the ideological is, one of the trap has always been that when we create an identity category, that it's a checkbox, right? If you don't meet these criteria, you're not a Chicano, this kind of thing. Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically say that identity doesn't work that way. Identity is actually a multiple phase thing, right? Anybody that understands identity understands it's multiple things. So when we look at, you know, I mean, it's a really complicated thing because we always have different identities for every situation we're in, right? Depending on your surroundings, you're gonna have different identities. I got my grad school at Texas A&M University. Texas A&M University is in East Texas, all right? So if you know anything about East Texas, it's one of the surrounding towns has in its centerpiece for their museum is the hanging tree. And on the plaque it says where over 500 African Americans were believed to be hung. And that is the centerpiece of their city museum. So, and they also have a statue on campus of one of the founders of A&M, who's also one of the grand wizards of the KKK. So when you're in that space, how do you navigate it, right? It's kind of the question. So you have to learn to choose things differently. You can either choose to respond aggressively, or you can choose to figure out how to navigate the waters. Well, I mean, basically what I'm saying is, like, I guess what you're asking is, if I get this right, is, you know, how do we work through this with identity? How do we kind of maintain who we are, but accept that the things are very different? This is a very different world, and everywhere we try to talk, it's a different crowd, right? We've had very different reactions for what we're doing, but I think that everybody has a voice, and then that's the one thing we're trying to say is there's always been multiple voices in the movement. It just hasn't always been presented that way because some voices are louder than others, right? But as long as we preach it as multiple voices instead of just one idea of what it is, then we can maybe change some of the ideas behind it, saying maybe you can find a way. And then you don't even have to be part of it, but to understand that it's always kind of been there for the past 60 years. Because Chicano started in the 1940s. Most people started in the 60s, but it actually started in the 1940s. So it's kind of how do we retell our histories, how do we reconnect, but I don't know if that answers your question or not, but it's kind of all over the place. But I mean, I think always reminding ourselves of where we came from and what's going on now, because I mean, a lot of what's happening now, I mean, in some ways this is actually worse than what happened in the 60s because we thought we were past it. I mean, and we come face to face with the fact that we're actually much, you know, if we look at Arizona, even though we see Arizona having these, you know, SB 1070, you know, HB 2230, which is the one that banned the Latino studies, has horrible things. Well, Texas doesn't even have a Chicano studies in their public school system. We're not even that advanced, so we get banned yet, you know. You know, it's kind of a strange concept. And so when we started looking at Arizona as being this horrible place, they had actually reached a point where there's still a lot of pushback, right? Texas, in a lot of ways, has not even gotten there. I mean, And so how do we combat that? And a lot of it, I think, is we have to really remind ourselves of our history, remind ourselves that these things that we're holding to, or these rights that we think we've gained, are not, and we have to constantly fight for them. It's never an ending fight. It's never going to stop. I mean, we always had to fight. I mean, civil rights started in this country in 1619 when they brought the first slaves over, right? I mean, this is a constant thing. We see civil rights as a 1960s issue, but they've been fighting for this since day one, right? It's a constant battle. And it's also, it's not a very hopeful message, because we want to say that we've gained rights in the civil rights era, and we have. But it's always a fight. You know, we always have to remain vigilant, because, look, we are 2008, we have SB 1070, right? I mean, that's insane when you think about what happened in the 1960s, right? Everything they fought for, and basically, well, no, yeah, and it's not just there in Texas, is starting to do things in the same vein, right? There's another in Florida, a whole lot of other places that are starting to pass this. I'm not sure where California is on this, but I know that you guys have had struggles with a lot of these issues. So, I mean, I think it's got to be something that, you know, as the Chicano word, the Chicano identity, is something that always is going to incite some sort of emotion, which is why we use it, right? It's going to have a conversation. It's always going to start something, because it's going to have a reaction. And that's kind of the point. I mean, that's what they started doing it back in the 60s, why they did it, right? They wanted to have a conversation because there wasn't one before. And as long as we're making conversations, I think we're making progress. That's just me. Right. I don't know if you had any more questions. Yes.
Last one.
Yes. It's all right.
I just wanted to know from each of you, what do you find two things that we all have in common? That not just here in this room, not on the topic of Chicano, just in the world. Two things that we all have in common.
Well, one of the things that I write about that I think we probably have in common is poverty. Right? Although I've been staying in Westwood, and I don't see poverty as much, but it's there. And you know what? It gets hidden. It gets like pushed back, right? Because I see the poverty, Gabriel's seen the poverty, right? But it's ignored. Like people just walk around it, right? But for me, I came from a poor background, and I'm not saying like dirt poor, right? I was still able to survive. My parents worked, but it wasn't to the standard of like what most people want to achieve, this American dream, right? So I think poverty would be one thing, and I think also for me it's having your own voice, right? So again, even though sometimes I don't identify with most people's opinions, not opinions, but a definition of Chicano, like Rossy was saying, like this concept of Chicano, I can be a part of. But otherwise, I usually wouldn't identify as Chicano. And having the ability to have a voice is important to me, and I think it's something that we have in common, because we always want to be talking about our experiences and what's important to us, right? And then usually what we find is when we talk, when we speak, we find that other people have the same ideas or have similar ideas that are just as important to them, right? And so when we get together, we start talking about these ideas, then like Chris was saying, you know, we can make a difference, we're showing progress. But for me, the common thing would be poverty and voice. And sometimes I talk about really like downer subjects, so sorry.
It's a tough one. I think Isaac kind of covered it pretty well. I think that one of the things that brings us all together in lots of different ways is we all have culture. I mean, we all have culture. And it's not necessarily something that should divide us. It's just something that we are. So that's one thing that we all do. And the other is, that's a good point. Isaac kind of stole the good ones. So Gabriel's going to have a tough time when he gets to the end of this. He's going to have nothing.
We have food in common.
Food, yes. We have
Thirst.
food.
And
hunger. No, but I think a lot of it is that we all have a need to tell our stories, right? That's kind of what he's saying. And I think everybody should be allowed to tell their story. Even if we don't agree with it, it should be out there, right? And so I would say that everybody has story and everybody has cultures, right? And all those, even though those things are almost the same thing, but that's what I would say the two things.
Well, the two things that we have in common, in my opinion, is that we're all moved by words. And that's the beauty of poetry. The second one would be that we all have this immense warmth inside our heart. And I think that's what has kept us together.
So my idea, Roman, read my mind. I would love to talk to your professors, man, because I bet you they'd be like, oh yeah, she makes me sweat every day. Man, what? Oh my goodness, these are some awesome questions. But I was thinking about it, and I don't want Rossy to think that I'm stealing, or copying her. But I was gonna say poetry too, but in the sense that, you're saying words, right? I'm saying poetry, but in the sense that, everybody in the world, everybody, no matter who you are, whether you're a writer or not, or if you're an artist or if you're a lawyer, everybody shares that ability to create within themselves, or, if you put it on paper, to create, so the power to create, artistic expression, these forms of creations of poetry manifest themselves in different ways. Sometimes through the way you raise your children, the way you address handling certain problems, when you're under stress. I mean, you can see somebody in action, right? And have you ever had that feeling that it's like, wow, it's like he's a conductor in an orchestra, or she, right? She's just handling this situation so beautifully. It's like an artist, like painting or writing a great novel or something, and they're doing nothing related to that, So I guess maybe more than poetry, art. We share that across the world, no matter who you are, what culture you come from. There's poetry, there's art in our everyday life. In our interpersonal gestures and things like that. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was this longing to belong, longing to belong to something greater than ourselves. That's why, I believe that's why the majority of us believe in a greater, higher power, Why else would we need to believe that there's more than just what you see here, what you can verify for yourself, with your own eyes, right? Because there's this longing to pertain to something bigger. You don't want to feel that great, immense loneliness, that if somebody were to tell us, hey, you know what? There really isn't God at all. Nothing like what you ever thought. How lonely would you feel then, That's the only thing that really unites us, at a soul level, right? And love. But sometimes, you equate love with God. God is love, right? So I think that those two things, the art in our everyday living and this need for belonging, like in the Eastern philosophies, like life and our pursuit in life is that longing to return to the source, to return to God, right? So that would be my two propositions there.
So to contextualize everything based off of what y'all said, what we all have in common is that we are nature, we are human, we are beings, and we're expressive. That's what unites us all.
Wow. Yes. You're gonna be the next member of C.O.N.C.A right here. Come over here. But I wanted to just briefly address what you were talking about earlier about Chicano being something that concept being something that creates barriers, because I can tell why it would feel like that, because you're in the midst of studying within an institution, right? So it's something that is being kind of like kind of loaded on you, It's kind of like being called a wetback. It's something that somebody else threw on you, and you have to carry it. No, you can't do anything about it. You have no choice. You're a wetback, and you have to carry that. It's kind of like a burden, And what we're trying to do is reverse that. We don't want to impose Chicanismo on people. We don't want to tell them, hey, you're Mexican American, or even Latino, whatever, and you live in the United States. Bam, you're Chicano. Hey, I don't identify as Chicano. No. You're Chicano, you know? Like, no, it's not like that, you know? It's like, we identify under that banner because it's a banner, you know? It's a means to create, you know, the sort of change that we are seeking, which is, you know, eventually, you know, this is me personally. I think pretty much, you know, identity to a certain extent, it's just it's elusive, and it's just an illusion, you know. But we cling to it because otherwise we start asking really deep questions, right? That force you to have to think. A lot of people just don't want to think. They just want to say, yeah, I'm American, you know. I'm a patriot, I'm American, you know, and that's it, bam. I like football and barbecue, you know, and beer, right? And you don't want to get out of that because that's a very comfortable place to be, you know, real nice and comfortable, right? And then somebody tells you, what is it to be an American? Cowboys, football, right? Beer. What else can you say that is being American? What do you mean? The red, white, and blue, you know? But what else? Deeper within. And then that's when, oh my goodness, that's when the crisis starts, right? Within the self. So people don't want to address really deep questions. A lot of people, you know, some of us do, some of us. And you obviously do. But I'm saying, like, within this group, we're trying to do that, open doors. Anybody who wants to come in, you don't have to ascribe to our you know, idea, because our idea is just our idea. We're just talking about it. We want to converse with you and see what your idea is, right? And maybe I learn something from you. It's not just me, you know, dictating. Yeah, it's not me dictating, you know. It's me wanting to learn, you know. It's us wanting to learn. And that's what we were trying to preach. We should all be wanting to ask questions, always evolving, always changing, you know. I don't want to remain, you know, box myself in this category where I'm Chicano and that's it. You know, I want to grow. I want to be, you know, become expansive, you know, mentally. Mentally.
I would like to throw in my 2 cents too. At first, it was kind of hard for me to identify as a Chicano, and you know, I'm Mexican American, and but from what I understood from the movement, I mean, I think one of the things that we all share is emotions. We all share. I'm a teacher, and the one thing in common that I see from the kids is their emotions, and I think that one of the most important emotions is that of feeling respected, and I think that's a very important part of the Chicano movement, and I think that's a very important part of the banner of Chicanismo, that respect to culture, heritage, and all those other things that go along with it. Any other questions? No? Okay. So again, this has been a wonderful event. We would like to extend our gratitude to the UCLA Chicano Research Center and everyone who is present, of course. Remember that the authors have their books for sale. And finally, I would like to say goodbye with the following quote by Gabriel Sanchez. La poesía es un arma cargada de futuro. Poetry is a weapon loaded with future. Thank you very much.
PowerPoint.